to really try to get the best of our speakers this afternoon in this short session is to have 10 minutes, your presentation, your key points, your sharing, and then we'll have 5 minutes of interaction with you audience and with the other panelists. Yeah? Would you like to start, Ambassador Philip Gibson?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. What I'm going to talk about today is the role of the private sector in New Zealand's approach to disaster risk management. And before doing so, just a quick word about New Zealand. You may think of us as a beautiful country, towering mountains, magnificent lakes, stable, relatively wealthy, well-educated, modest, nice people. Yes, we are. We're all of that. We are also disaster prone. Floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, you name it, we've got it. And so what I'm going to say today is shaped very much by the lessons we have learned and continue to learn, particularly from the series of earthquakes and aftershocks that devastated Christchurch, New Zealand's second largest city, in February 2011. And I will say, because I'm here in Thailand, that very sadly, amongst the numbers of people who died in that tragedy were some young Thais, and we continue to grieve for them. The main point that I want to make is the role of the private sector. The private sector is fundamental to functioning communities and so is critical to community resilience. And this is especially so in coping in the immediate aftermath of a disaster and getting recovery underway. We need to be able to harness the private sector in our disaster risk management planning and what it brings to the table. So, to begin, whatever your economic philosophy, doing business, the exchange of goods and services, these basic activities underpin communities and societies. When those wheels are stopped or impaired, so too is the community. A major lesson for New Zealand from the Christchurch earthquakes was just how important the role of the private sector is in maintaining a functioning society and particularly in getting recovery underway. And a quick story from Christchurch. An immediate and devastating result of the earthquakes in February 2011 was that the whole of the central business district had to be shut down immediately. 6,000 businesses, 50,000 people closed, evacuated, immediate. Over 90% of the businesses in Christchurch were small and medium enterprises. Now, SMEs, as we've heard earlier today, are fundamental in most economies, and they are especially vulnerable in disasters. So, out of their premises, no business, no work, critically, no cash flow. What the government did in response was to provide a quick subsidy to employers to help them pay their employees. It was roughly $500 New Zealand per week per full-time employee, and it lasted several weeks. Paperwork was kept to the minimum. The scheme was operated largely on trust and involving private sector leaders such as the Chamber of Commerce, and that was critical. Certainly in New Zealand, business people talk much more easily to other business people than they do to government officials. And I suspect that's the case in many other countries too. The essential point of this support was that it was to the employers, not to the employees. The objective was to keep businesses going, keep people employed. And it was remarkably successful. International experts had predicted a 20% drop in Christchurch's GDP post-earthquake. It did dip a few percent in the first few months, but it quickly recovered and has performed strongly ever since. A second important lesson from Christchurch was the role of the private sector going beyond business continuity and into driving recovery. Leadership and communication from business leaders was critical in community reassurance and community confidence. And I'll give you just one example of this. Right down in the middle of Christchurch, in the epicentre, there was an old, iconic department store called Ballantyne's. It was closed. Everything was closed. You know, the whole place was evacuated. Ballantyne's itself, I think, was pretty munted. As soon as business started to get re-established, the founding family of Ballantyne's, Sir Richard Ballantyne, or Richard Ballantyne, said, "We are reopening." And that was an incredibly powerful message to the whole Christchurch community. Ballantyne's is back. Whether they did any business, whether they made much money, I don't know. Personally, I doubt it. But boy, what a message. And there were some really innovative private sector initiatives as well, such as setting up a central retail precinct using shipping containers, establishing an IT cluster, and working with the government and other stakeholders in developing a very effective public-private partnership approach to horizontal infrastructure repair. Now, just a quick word on this particular public-private sector initiative. Intuitively, for me, and I think for most people, horizontal infrastructure, and that's about pipes and sewers and all that stuff that's under the ground, this should be the realm of big-chested, hard-hatted engineers. Blokes in boots, big machines, drilling holes and doing things. Now, this project, about $3 billion, was driven, yes, by big blokey engineers, but critically in partnership with the Red Cross. An unlikely, but as it turned out, superbly effective combination. Sure, drilling holes and doing things, but also talking to, engaging with, understanding community wants and needs. 5, 6 years down the track, we're still learning lessons around recovery and the private sector's critical input. And one of those lessons is that recovery just does not happen on its own accord. Recovery doesn't just begin when the immediate response is over. Planning for recovery has to be right at the beginning of what we call the 4 R's: risk, readiness, response, recovery. You've got to be planning for recovery, not right at the end, but right at the beginning when you're talking about your risk reduction. So this raises the question of how can the private sector best contribute in the whole disaster risk management cycle. We know from experience in New Zealand its critical role in societal resilience when a disaster happens, and its critical role in recovery. But how can we harness the potential, the power of the private sector in the whole disaster risk management process, in the whole quest for resilience? In my view, the private sector has a real role to play in this. And the main driver, and I'm conscious of a question that was asked at the end of the last session about how to incentivise the private sector, to me, the incentive, the main driver, is self-interest. The private sector is about business. At the end of the day, it's about making money, it's about making a profit. And it cannot do that if a community is completely devastated by a disaster. And at the same time, a fundamental driver of community well-being is people being gainfully employed, earning an income. So there is mutual and complementary interest between the private sector and the wider community in working towards resilience. I think this is increasingly being recognised, and easy evidence of that is this conference and what we've heard up until now. At the same time, there is probably no one formula for effective private sector involvement. It's likely horses for courses. It will happen at different speeds, it will happen at different levels, it will happen at different degrees of economic sophistication, from society to society, community to community. In New Zealand, both a consequence and a driver of the increased emphasis on risk management and resilience is that DRM, disaster risk management, is no longer the preserve of the Emergency Management Authority. Of course, the Emergency Management Authority remains central, but it is a multi-sector, multi-discipline exercise. Within our government, Treasury is involved, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, the Ministry of the Environment and a range of others, and my own ministry, for instance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And they bring with them particular links into the private sector. So the private sector is increasingly drawn into the discussions around resilience, and in some instances, in New Zealand, the private sector have mandated roles. And an example of this is certain utilities. We call them lifeline utilities. They may be power, they may be water. They are required under our emergency management legislation to undertake civil defence emergency management. At the same time, and particularly as a result of the Christchurch experience, some of the bigger private sector players are actively seeking to contribute to building business and wider societal resilience. A group has been formed called Resilient New Zealand. Its aim is to grow New Zealand's resilience, and I quote from one of its booklets, "We see this not only as surviving a disaster, but thriving in the recovery and turning adversity into opportunity." Could have been written by a government official. There will be similar groups in a number of countries represented at this conference. I know there are. I've had some personal interaction with them. And a particular challenge, which is a theme here, is how to cover small and medium enterprises. Big companies have the wherewithal to think about and plan risk management. SMEs obviously less so. But they can be, and indeed they are, critical in the supply chain on which the bigger players depend. And I come back again to this concept of self-interest. And I know one particular ASEAN country I visited recently and visited a disaster foundation driven largely by big companies. They're doing work for the SMEs because the SMEs are critical in their supply chain, and so they see it as in their self-interest to be helping them build resilience. A final comment. Let me say that again. I found giving speeches that as soon as I say the word to sum up or in conclusion or final, there's almost a palpable sense of relief. People sit up straight. So I'll say it again. A final comment. I think the insurance industry has a growing role in the whole DRM space. Insurance is about understanding risk, and there is tremendous expertise and experience in that industry in that respect. Also for New Zealand, insurance is a powerful tool in resilience. We have very high levels of insurance. It has played a crucial role in the Christchurch experience. More than 80% of Christchurch's losses are covered by insurance. Now, insurance can be a complex and sensitive and very political area. But there's no doubt that Christchurch's ability to recover, regenerate, bounce back better, and the whole New Zealand economy would have been markedly different without it. So, in conclusion, my main point, the private sector is fundamental to functioning communities and so is critical to community resilience, especially in coping in the immediate aftermath of a disaster and getting recovery underway. We need to be able to harness the private sector in our DRM planning and what it brings to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Philip Gibson, for sharing with so so many insights, your analysis of the tragedy that impacted your country. Any reaction from the panelists? Any things you would like to mention right now before we pass the floor to the audience? No? Nothing special? Okay. Are there some questions in the audience? Some comments about what you've just heard? Yeah, please. Thank you.
Your Excellency, I'm from Krungsri Bank. I've been observing the crisis in Christchurch on the seismic activities and the effect. And I understand that right now, Wellington and several other places in New Zealand now being upgraded on their building code, and they have windows of retrofitting to have all those buildings to adhere to the new building code. Otherwise, it has to be dismantled, has to be bring it down. But I could not be able to find more articles about this. Just would like to find out whether you have any knowledge that you could share of the updates of what's been going now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm surprised if you haven't been able to find material about it. It is a big subject in New Zealand. Look, somebody once said, hanging concentrates the mind. Disasters concentrate the mind. Having a major earthquake like Christchurch concentrates the mind around building regulations, our various codes and whatever. Generally, the codes in New Zealand are pretty good. Generally, compliance is pretty good. But you're absolutely right. Post the Christchurch earthquakes, city councils around New Zealand have been having another look, and they have been requiring businesses, building owners to increase the strictness of the building codes. It's a very, very complex issue because somebody has to pay for this. Look, let me talk to you afterwards, rather than try and give you the absolute answer of where you can access information. But as I said, I'm surprised if you've been having difficulty because there's a whole lot of government bodies in New Zealand who are involved. There's a lot of academic, there's a lot of business, and indeed there's a lot of insurance literature around it. So I'm making a mental note of who you are and where you're seated, and I'll come and see you afterwards. Thank you.
Any other reaction or question? I would like to highlight, I liked very much, Ambassador Gibson, when you mentioned how important was the role of the Chambers of Commerce. Now when we respond to emergencies or when we do disaster risk reduction, we're more used to work at community-based level, and actually who do we go and see? The community leaders. And here you mentioned that actually, yes, to talk to the business people, get business people, business leaders to intermediate and to be there to find the right words, to create the space for them to be confident, to share what they need. So that was very, very interesting for us, disaster risk reduction practitioners and emergency responders. The partnership, you mentioned partnership with the Red Cross, and also sort of the self-interest, but that is common interest. I mean, the self-interest of the business, they need to make profit, on that we need to talk to them, but at the same time, they cannot make profit if the community is devastated. Yeah? And the community cannot recover if they don't get a job and a salary. So it's very interesting to see and to hear from your experience and your analysis how simple is all connected. Thank you very much, and may I call our following speaker, Mr. Stefan Helming, to share with us your experience. Thank you. Please help me welcome.
Yes, good afternoon. And Thank you for having me here. My name is Stefan Helming. I'm the country director of the GIZ. In your program is printed the name of Martin Hoppe, representing the German government in Germany, who is responsible for this whole topic. He was desperate to come here and deliver his speech himself, but for some reason his superiors, I think they decided he had to do something else. So he told me, please, to give you his heartfelt greetings, to tell you that Germany is totally committed to help implementing the Sendai results, and also that he is very interested in mutual learning. Germany learning from Southeast Asia learning from Germany, how that can be organized. Having said that, just a few remarks. Germany is very similar to the region here in Southeast Asia, as we have just heard, because of the predominance of the SMEs, the small and medium companies, as the backbone of the economy, backbone of employment, backbone of innovation, and a lot of the production. It's not the big companies, it's the small companies. So there's a similarity. There's also something which is not so similar. Germany is very lucky that we don't have these big disasters like typhoon, earthquake, volcano. This has not been really happening in Germany. So our disasters are all created by ourselves when we first start a war and then we lose it. But we have stopped doing that the last 70, 80 years. Even with that, disasters do happen. I have, I don't know whether we can show this on the camera. I don't know, you can see this power pylon collapsing. In 2005, there was a big disaster. 82 of these big power transmission towers collapsed, and the whole region, because of snow and ice. Unexpected load of snow and ice, very wet snow, very heavy. 82 collapsed, and 200,000 people were out of power for 2-3 days in a rural area. Now, this was a big disaster, a bigger disaster than it seemed, because even in the agricultural areas today, everything is so much depending on power supply. Even the farms, they could not milk the cows because they need automatic milking machinery. They couldn't feed the pigs because that's also done by automatic machines. So it was not only the people being cold because their heating systems didn't work, everything collapsed, and they had to rush to nearby Holland, that was not far from the Holland border, to get generators and emergency supplies. But it taught us a lesson. You were saying, Ambassador, disasters concentrate the minds. That is very true. It taught a lesson, and the responsible agency called the Federal Office for Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance then started a process of, together with the business community, of analyzing the risk, because people are not used to this type of risk. It came out of the blue, and they did a survey, and they found out that I think 2/3 of the companies didn't have any emergency plans, didn't have any disaster readiness plans, nothing like that. It simply wasn't part of the corporate culture. So they started a process of analyzing the situation, analyzing the interdependencies in a very much technology-driven country of the interdependencies of the technologies and of the infrastructure. And they initiated this integrated risk management procedure with the government and the private stakeholders to come up and create some more awareness and also new procedures. In Germany, this seems to be the case that we always have to strike a disaster before we really get working. But the good thing is that the structures are already there so that they could achieve this result quite quickly. It's also interesting that in Germany, the disaster response systems in themselves are sort of a PPP model, a cooperation between private sector and government, because most of the fire brigades and also disaster response forces are actually volunteers. These are volunteers who get training and they have equipment sitting there somewhere parked close to where they are. They are supported by some professionals, but most of the force is volunteers, but highly trained people who work obviously in companies, most of them in the SMEs. And the companies have agreed and do agree to release these people for training for a while, for a week or two, but also when disaster happens, to release them so they can immediately leave their workplace, even when the company itself is not at all affected, and rush to the disaster. They get some financial compensation, but they have to say, yes, my best people are now gone for a while. So that's a PPP type of approach for the disaster management system. Also, floods happened in Germany several times in the last decade, and again it was shown how big the impact was on the business community, and interestingly a lot of impact on the businesses that were not themselves at all affected by the flood, because the supply chains were affected. Today nobody keeps warehouses, everything is on the road. So when one element of the supply chain collapses, the whole supply chain collapses, and companies have to stop working because one component is missing, because nothing is in stock. That also taught a lesson. By the way, you said earlier I was responsible for water management before. Of course, these floods have a lot to do with water management. Some of it may be climate change, but a lot of it is the way we manage our rivers, using a lot of rivers as waterways and straightening the rivers, which then increases the flow of the river. And when a big rain comes, all of a sudden floods are much bigger than before. And I think it's very good that we now have this European Framework Directive for water management, which forces local governments, state governments, to cooperate with each other, because the rivers don't respect the state boundaries, but also to cooperate with stakeholders, with business and civil society stakeholders in water management. This is a directive by the European Union, and it's implemented in German law and in the law of the other European nations. I think it will give, it's a good approach to prevent also disasters by managing rivers in a different way. And there's a big debate of whether we need to set our rivers free again, because a lot have been, as I said, used for transport and so on, and harnessed much more than maybe is needed. So by freeing the rivers and letting them flow as the way nature designed them, could help with flood and management and disaster prevention also. Another thing is that, of course, a lot of industries, businesses, were allowed to put up shop in areas that are prone for flooding. Areas that were free of no settlement, because precisely for hundreds of years it was known that from time to time these areas would be flooded. And then these places grow, the cities grow, the towns grow, and you look for new areas to put industry. You allow them to put industry in these areas, and then all of a sudden everybody is surprised that the place gets flooded. I think we also need to review these rules, because I like this distinction between disaster resistance and disaster resilience. Disaster resistance meaning, yes, we defeat the risk, we protect our city, we protect our industry, and when the flood comes, nothing will happen, it will be protected. But that can only happen to a certain degree, and it also becomes extremely costly if you try to do it for every type of risk and for every place. So in comes this notion of disaster resilience, which means we try and develop coping mechanisms and try to manage the disaster, but also try and manage our response better. Yes, maybe I don't need to preach you about the necessity to involve the private sector when you are government, and I don't need to preach you on the necessity to work with government when you are business. I think, on the disaster response that has been said so many times, and I don't need to repeat that. It is very clear. Maybe only one word of why we are here and why we are supporting this event also. This is part of the a thing called a Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management, which was set up by the BMZ, which is the ministry in Germany responsible for international cooperation and development. And they were a little bit innovative in setting up this initiative because it comprises 3 or 4 different ministries in Germany. All the relevant ministries in Germany were put together in a task force, and also private sector involvement. Normally, also this ministry will work on its own, make an agreement with Thailand or Indonesia or Philippines on a project and go ahead and implement it, but this time is different. They said, no, we must involve all the various government institutions and the private sector to make this happen. So it's an innovative approach in itself. Some of the sub-projects of this initiative, for example, working in Bangladesh on fire safety and risk prevention in the garment industries. We've all heard about the big calamity in Bangladesh when a company that makes garments, which are then exported to Germany, when it burned and hundreds of women died. So that was a wake-up call to work on this risk. There's the Hotel Resilient initiative in the Asia-Pacific region, which I'm sure will also feature more in detail in our technical sessions. And there's, of course, this process that we are happy to be able to support, of which we have just heard when we heard all the ladies from the various countries report on their survey with the SMEs. We feel that is a very nice response, and we're really happy to work with that system. And it is, I think, also one element where we can learn from Southeast Asia, because we don't have such a center for advice and technical support to businesses with regard to disaster risk management. And yes, it's one of the learning initiatives. Maybe one last thought. There's now another directive by the European Union on non-financial reporting for all the, well, it's for the time being only for big businesses, where they have to write a report on the social footprint, ecological footprint, and also compliance, corruption, and so on. And I was just wondering whether disaster risk prevention would not be an element that should also, because it's also an integral part of a sustainability strategy for any business, whether that should also not be a sort of mention in there. I'm not sure whether it is, but I think it's been left out, but that would be one idea. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing the experience of Germany and its disasters and the other conceptual thing and practical thing you've shared with us. Any reaction from our panelists or question? Question from the audience? What I would like to highlight for the topic of our discussion right now, interesting to see that when you tell us about these 82 pylons that collapsed, how it affected not only the citizens, but also your agriculture, because now it's all automatic. No? And then 2/3 of the companies didn't have actually any business continuity plan or emergency response plan. It would be interesting to see now if this had an impact and if they've been able to change this attitude. Now you told us about the PPP approach of disaster response, no? These volunteers that are your firefighters and the emergency responders who actually needs to be released by the company, so a sort of contribution to disaster response. Your invitation to look at disaster resilience instead of disaster resistance. So some businesses that were authorized to be in flood-prone areas, well, housing would not be. Maybe they're resistant, but is that resilience? So things to look at when we think about motivating SMEs to invest in disaster risk reduction? Last chance for a question, a reaction? No? Okay. Yes? Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for your thing. I just have one small question for Ambassador Philip Gibson and even Stefan Helming for your suggestion. If you are the government, what you recommend us, or if you have a chance or opportunity to provide the advisor for the government to support SME to do the BCP, what will you tell the government to do? The first question. Is the second, for the SME themselves, what do you think, how do you think to motivate them to involve in the BCP, even that they are very low education or even low background on the BCP? Even, you know that the agriculture sector, most of them, the owner are very low education. For example, in our country, most of the owner graduates is about 30 to 40%. And even the higher education are very small. But normally, if they are the agriculture or fishery something, they're very low level of their education. So how do you think that which method is good for them to involve in the BCP or to make them resilient after the disaster? Thank you very much.
That's for me.
Your question was directed to someone, especially to whom? Sorry. Ambassador Gibson. Ah, yes, Ambassador Gibson.
Thank you very much. Gosh, what a wonderful world. If I were able to give one word of advice to a government and know that the government would actually listen. Look, frankly, I think, if I was, and we do talk about these things in New Zealand, in the government, frankly, talk to people, communicate with them, explain to people the risks involved in the environment we've lived in. Now, in New Zealand, because we have lots of natural disasters all the time, people, I think, are reasonably attuned to risk and the need to provide for risk. And following the Christchurch earthquakes, businesses do think about it. Now, the problem is human nature. We forget. And although at present people do think about risk and businesses do think about continuity and recovery and resilience and all of that, certainly in Christchurch, will they in 5 or 10 years' time? And I think that is a challenge to keep people thinking about it. But I think, rather than giving people money or saying there should be a government program to do A, B, C, it's about getting people to think about it. It's about communicating with them. Your second question relating to levels of education, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Again, I think principally it's about appealing to people's self-interest. If a farmer who is not so well educated sees that if he or she does something, it's going to help them, well, I think they're going to be more inclined to do so. So I think communication and identifying people's self-interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I invite Mr. Tim Helming to share his contribution? Thank you. Please help me welcome Mr. Tim Manning.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. Take just a few minutes to talk about maybe the American perspective. First, I want to thank ADPC for hosting this very important forum. We've heard a lot of references today to the Sendai framework and recent work and effort and policy statements pointing towards the importance of engaging the private sector in disaster resilience and disaster risk reduction. But I want to point back even a little bit further, back to 2011, at an APEC meeting in Honolulu, where then Secretary Hillary Clinton hosted a high-level policy dialogue on disaster resilience. This was just just shy of a year after the Great Tohoku earthquake. So foreign ministers and leaders from across the Asia Pacific gathered for a lengthy conversation, the concluding statement of which points to the need, encouraging all of the economies across the APEC area to engage the private sector, to engage business in disaster resilience, disaster risk reduction, specifically calling on economies to provide tools for business to help prepare, to include voluntary standards, templates for business continuity plans, to help facilitate movements of goods and services, to promote community-based approaches, support research and education, and promote public-private partnerships. So this is something we've all been working on for quite some time. It wasn't just a realization then, it just, as we heard earlier, focused the mind and brought leaders of all our economies, of all our nations together to further this cause. So in the context of my experience, of our experience in the United States in this, and let me add my contribution to the statistics and the numbers you've been hearing throughout the day. I wouldn't be a good government official if I didn't throw out some numbers and statistics. So let me please do that. So in the United States, very similar to where you've heard of other numbers, SMEs account for, well, in companies smaller than 50 employees, or I'm sorry, smaller than 20 employees, that's 89% by number of the businesses in the United States. And if you go up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500, that's 99% of companies in the U.S. economy. They make up about half of our GDP, about 50%, varies by tenths of a percent year over year. 50% of our GDP are SME companies. Now, when we do analysis, we interview, survey businesses across the United States. We find that 60%, 2/3 say that being prepared for crisis, being prepared for disasters is important, is something they should do. And if we look at those somewhat larger, the medium-sized enterprises, the 400 or 500 employees, we have about the same ratio of having a plan, having a business continuity plan. But when you get down to the smaller enterprises, the 20, the 30 employees that make up that 90%, that 89 to 90% of our businesses, that number drops down to 30%. Just 1/3 of businesses, of the 90% of businesses in the United States, have actually done any business continuity planning, any kind of disaster planning. And when we ask why have you not done that, the response is predominantly, quote, the selection of it's not worth it. It's not worth the time. It's not worth the effort. And then if we look and see companies, these SME, these small business, as we categorize them in our statistics, that are impacted by a disaster, only half ever reopen. The other half just go away. They fold for a number of different reasons. So as you've heard it many times so far today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I see. This is the topic of this particular session being how do we encourage private sector involvement. Well, kind of the perspective that I've been working under for a while is kind of two sides to the coin. And one is, of course, to appeal to the self-interest. Now, it's one thing to communicate and say, of you businesses, this is something we've been doing for a number of years, you 90% of the U.S. economy, you got a 50-50 chance of coming back. Well, actually, you have 100% or 0% chance. If you do no planning, you're likely not going to recover from that impact, from that disaster. So we have to link the interests of the business sector, of these small business sectors. We've got to appeal to the self-interest through experiences, but we also have a reason, there's another challenge I think that we face in encouraging the private sector involvement in disaster risk reduction. And let me flip that around and say that challenge is not encouraging the private sector involvement in disaster risk reduction, it's encouraging the government to involve the private sector in disaster risk reduction. You heard an example this morning from our wonderful facilitator about that just in recent years that there were these kind of fora that we engage back and forth? Well, I know from experience that it is extremely difficult to get emergency managers, to get the government side, the crisis management, to take the time. We're so focused on carrying out the mission. We're so focused on the tasks we're assigned by our legislative authorities and by our executive authorities that it's often difficult to take the time to work with the private sector. And I can tell you from experience too, that often the first response of government officials is to seal everybody off, right? When there's a disaster, to say, okay, here's the cordon, you can't come in. You heard examples earlier, and I can give you many others of when there's a disaster of putting up roadblocks, and we close off areas that are dangerous, and then which causes a stagnation to the potential recovery. So the approach that we've been kind of looking at is to look at this from two sides of a coin. You have on one side of the coin what we have traditionally encouraged in business continuity, in the private sector, preparedness for disaster risk reduction. And that's just simply a business continuity plans, because if you have a continuity plan and you are impacted, you'll be able to reopen again and hopefully maintain a status quo. Well, it goes beyond that. There's additional efforts that can be put in, not the least of which is increased market share. So as an example, in Joplin, Missouri, we had one of the largest tornadoes ever recorded in the United States. Massive damage, destruction across the city. And these are examples of small and medium enterprises, more of a large enterprise, smaller manifestation. Two large home goods stores, we call box stores in the United States. Hardware stores, building materials, across the street from each other. One completely destroyed, and the other not nearly so destroyed. Now, the one that was more prepared, that had stronger building resilience, everybody that was going to, they took all of the market. But the other one had a plan in place, had a business continuity plan in place, and they reopened within days in their parking lot. The corporation had plans in place to bring in tents, bring in materials, surge their supply chains into the area, and they were able to preserve their market share within that community because they had that plan. They had an opportunity to have completely lost their customer base, but they didn't because they had the plans in place. Other examples of two similar but more focused on groceries and home goods examples. One, where the supply chain, there was a disparate level of planning in the supply chain. One reopened the next day, one reopened weeks and weeks later, and that took a great deal of time to reclaim that market share. So there's an appeal to be had in encouraging small and medium enterprises to plan not just to maintain their status quo, but to actually either sustain or grab market share. Because as has been pointed out, business is in the business of business. The other side of that, when we try to encourage the government side to do things to help facilitate this planning and the carrying out of this planning, is to realize that we are all in this together. If we focus simply on my mission as a government ministry, to say that this is what I have to do and I'm going to deliver disaster services in the case of a crisis, and ignore how the normal economy functions in that community, I'm going to have an increased expense to be able to do that mission. I'm going to have extremely difficult lines of communication and supply chain in order to provide those services, and I'm going to hamper the recovery of that community. We have to build our processes from the government level with an understanding and a close understanding of how the economy of that community truly operates. Some of it in the leadership in my agency came to the realization a number of years ago. One of my colleagues likes to tell the story of, he was in a parking lot, it was a hurricane in the Gulf states of the United States. Widespread destruction, power outages, supply chains disrupted. And so he was providing food, water, and ice out of the back of trucks. Free food, water, and ice to the affected people in the community in the parking lot of an open grocery store, which was trying to sell water, and ice. Now, of course, everybody wants to go get the free stuff. You can't fault them for that. But we did no good, no help to that community by taking customers away from the grocery store, where the people who live there work, and help getting that community back online. And we could have focused our resources on places where there were no open retail. There was no market available to the public. We couldn't prioritize. Another example of, so understanding that the supply chain, that the existing economy is a help to the government, is a help to the whole community to be able to provide disaster assistance, is integral to be able to have this, what we call our whole community preparedness for disaster response. Another example is of having that close connection and being able to facilitate the private sector and facilitate the market to help provide assistance is in Hurricane Sandy, which some of you may remember a few years ago, a large hurricane that came ashore in the southeast corner of the United States, ran up the coast all the way up to the northeast corner of the United States, hitting every community along the way and making landfall in New York and New Jersey. One of the biggest impacts we saw in the immediate aftermath was with the large degree of power outages came a large degree of fuel shortage because of gasoline, the gas stations, fuel stations throughout the area couldn't pump gas. Now in the southeast where they have a lot of hurricanes, they've got a lot of power backup, our fuel stations are built with the ability to take generators and pump fuel with supplemental power. That's not the case in the Northeast because it's uncommon. So we had a few options. One of the things on the table was, well, we'll need to bring in the military and bring in fuel and just dispense fuel on a street corner from a military fuel truck. Now, there's no way, the military is not set up to take money. They're not a business. So we were faced with potentially just giving away gasoline for an extended period of time, or working with the fuel distribution companies to be able to get power restored, prioritized to the fuel station so that we could get the economy back, we could get the market working the way the market should be working, and get the community back up quicker. So there are many other examples of this kind of partnership that's developed over the years. So let me just point out a few things that we're trying to do with recognition of all these potential issues. So the first, with that encouragement, how do we encourage our local, in our case, our local emergency managers in the United States? We have the 56 states and territories and thousands of cities and counties across the country where where that planning and where that activity happens. So how do we encourage that? Well, one, we're trying to provide new information and tools and education on the economic impacts of planning decisions that we have been making for generations. One of which, for example, we plan to shelter displaced persons in storms in schools. If you put shelteries in a school, the school closes. If the school closes, the kids stay home. If the kids stay home, the parents stay home and can't go to work. Then if you're trying to run a small business with 15 employees, and 12 of those employees have to stay home with their children, how's your business going to fare? Now, if I'm the mayor of that community and I'm trying to get my community back, and I can't get my community functioning again because my businesses are closed, because their workers are home, because their kids are home, because I didn't put my shelter people in the community center, I put them in the school. Simple decisions that have secondary and tertiary effects that haven't been modeled or thought through that we can do better. Encouraging the value of preparedness for our private sector through a number of different, which I'll get to in just a second. The other is the advent of business to emergency operation centers, called BEOCs. We have operation centers throughout levels of government, but to pull the private sector in to work within our operation centers so they can share information, even albeit temporarily, about their supply chain, about their availability back and forth. But we have to be careful to not disadvantage the small and medium-sized enterprises, to disadvantage the small businesses, because it's very easy to establish relationships with one large corporate entity that has franchise presence everywhere and disadvantage the small enterprises. And then finally, this is the big sigh of relief, finally, national communications efforts. So I encourage you all, if it'd be of any use to you, to go to a website at www.ready.gov/business. Ready.gov is the American government's effort to reach out to the public to build preparedness, both on the individual and different sectors. Well, we have an effort specifically focused on business, where we have template business continuity plans, everything from how do you establish program management within your company of different sizes, through doing the planning process, through building employee preparedness, because if your employees can't come to work, no amount of planning for your business is going to help. All the tips and tools there, and they're made available for anybody to use. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time and encourage everybody to continue to reject the notion that there is a difference between whose name is on the paycheck. Business, government, individuals, we are all in this together. We have equal responsibility in preparedness, equal responsibility to share our efforts and resources in response and recovery. Thank you very much.
Any question? Reaction? Yeah, please. Can we have a mic for the person over there? Thank you very much.
Thank you, team. I'm Thang Im from the ASA Foundation. I share with you this morning very shortly that we use a lot of your great stuff on your website for our training for businesses in Vietnam on disaster risk reduction. We start the initiative in 2011, funded by OFDA, USAID. I really share with you the challenges when we try to engage business in disaster risk reduction. Could you please share with us what kind of your government initiative to engage business? Because you doing the communication all the time, you talk with business a lot, but they need the initiative to. I absolutely agree with the ambassador that we need to make disaster risk reduction to become a core interest of businesses. Otherwise, we cannot, engage business in our works. So, what kind of initiatives that from the government to, engage business in this, disaster risk reduction in particular? The second question: how do you measure the impacts of your program in terms of, for us, it's really hard to measure, the impact of our program because we don't know in the future how much business, can save their property or asset losses from the disaster, for example. It's really hard. In your experience, how can you measure that? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So it does work. Good. Being in charge of preparedness, I'm prepared with 2 microphones, but this one is working, so I'll use that. Those are great questions, fantastic questions. I'm going to do my best to ignore the second one because I don't know the answer. I'm kidding. I'll try to get at that. As first, the engagement part, great question, and I think part of that solution. So we have this effort, this nationwide engagement effort, where we are trying to reach out through public service announcements, or commercials basically that we run, trying to get the message to business and to individuals to prepare and appeal to both, like some are humorous, some are more serious, maybe even borderline on frightening. Try to appeal all the different ways to try to engage, get people's interest and drive them to these websites, to these tools to help build a level of awareness. In fact, I'll be doing another one coming on. We call our satellite media tours for like 7 or 8 hours. I do 5-minute back-to-back interviews in TV stations across the country, trying to get people in the drive time. We just try to reach out, but that only works to a certain degree. And that's why I think it's important that we try to engage the rest of the profession. It's one thing for FEMA, for the federal government, for the national government, to put an advertisement or a billboard or a commercial out. But what really needs to happen, especially when you're talking about 80–90% of the economy being small businesses, you need that kind of retail engagement. You need local community leaders talking to the local business leader. And me talking from Washington is not going to reach that business of 6 people in a small town in Kansas or somewhere around the country. So it's important for, I think, us to also engage government officials to express to them the value to them. This is that self-interest thing, that they have a self-interest in getting their businesses prepared. Not just the business self-interest for their own bottom line, but the mayors and the local leaders, local town leaders, that they have an interest in keeping their economy up by getting them prepared, that they'll recover that much quicker. There are many examples of us spending a lot of time and effort and money on recovery, putting in, building back better, to find that the economy never came back and this town's, the community still died. The economy is the most important thing to get that back functioning. So I think it's not just focusing on business, it's on focusing on the local leaders to drive their business leaders to do this. It's a big communal self-interest. And as far as measuring success, I mean, that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Now, we have a number of different programs we use engaging the public sector. We have performance-based analysis like most governments. Most of that tends to come down on, the numbers you would have to see change would be those, for example, that 49% of businesses never reopen. You'd have to be able to tie back who's got a plan and can we change that? But that's such a large data set. So we tend to come back on case studies, and then the old example of the plural of an anecdote isn't data. So I don't know that really is a solution either. That's something I think we'll all struggle with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tim Manning, for these really concrete examples. And I would like to remind, for the purpose of our session, 2 main things. One is, again, we come back to the self-interest. There is self-interest, it's easy. How can we communicate on it? How can we discuss with SMEs to convince them of their interest in investing in disaster risk reduction? And also your invitation of a shift of mentality in governmental and non-governmental institutions in charge of disaster response and disaster risk reduction. Now, how do we think differently on the way we deliver the humanitarian assistance, the way we take our decisions in terms of emergency response that may be hindering the private sector to recover or to get engaged, and also how we open the space in disaster risk reduction to the private sector. Thank you very much. Let me call now Mr. Pujiono. Oh, sorry, I think I've mispronounced your name. Pujiono from UNESCAP to share his views on our topic. Please help me welcome Mr. Pujiono. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point now, nothing that I will say that have not been said. That's a good thing. I'm standing in front of you in a very, very privileged position. One, I'm standing here not because I'm graduated from a fancy school. It's because I've been doing this business for about 25 years. I've been seeing disasters in tsunami, in Indonesia, in Namibia, in Myanmar, everywhere. That's one. Second, I'm very privileged to be part of the United Nations. In Asia Pacific, my office is a secretariat to 63 countries of Asia Pacific that meet every year and make decisions and regional policies with regard to a wide range of development-related matters. So from that vantage point, I will be sharing with you some of my key observations. But to start, it will be good to just compare Asia Pacific with the rest. I think I would dare say Asia Pacific is one of the most resilient regions in the world, either by choice, by design, or just by default, right? Asia Pacific, let me just show you some of the figures. A person living in Asia or the Pacific, including expatriates, right, are 6 times more likely to be hit by disasters compared to those who live in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now that's something. And Asia Pacific resident is nearly 30 times more likely to be exposed to disasters compared to North America and Europe. Now that will already affect. Now, that being said, throughout the day you have heard how private sectors have been affected by disasters and how SMEs are most affected. I will not repeat on that, but I would like to invite you to look at different side of that. Surely you are familiar with Sendai framework by now. I sit in the Philippines a couple months back when I shared a panel with Tim and also with Ambassador Gibson. When I was much younger, our business used to be just confined on managing the consequences of disasters when it happened. And then after Hyogo, we were presented with, we should not deal with the consequences. We should try to reduce the risk when we know it. And then the risk reduction come forward. And then the BCP become important. But what I'm telling you now, I think BCP is not even sufficient. Our great realization in Sendai last year was that while we managed to reduce the absolute number of deaths, the economic losses increases tremendously. What happened? There must be something wrong in the way we do development. One, I think we managed to do risk reduction pretty good. But the fact that many of our assets and capitals are lost by disasters, something must be wrong, which is why I'm saying BCP is no longer sufficient. I think it is a challenge for all of us to think, how could we help and work with SMEs to be more risk-informed, even before they start investing on their meager capitals, right? Because if you do BCP, you are one step behind the disaster, I can tell you that. Now, that being said, the key argument today, since everybody talk a bit about BCP, for my side, push it forward. How can we help SME to think once, twice before they start putting their meager capitals in the business? Now, responding to the colleague from Vietnam who was asking, what's the modus operandi? How can we work with this? Let me tell you, your governments in their annual meeting in Bangkok every year, they give very strong message. There is no sustainable development in Asia Pacific without disaster risk management. That is sound very loud and clear. But the challenge is the same like what you asked. How do we do it? At the principle level, all of us subscribe. As we all subscribe, we should be good person. You and I agree. But how do we get there? Just a couple months back, ESCAP, my office, in collaboration with ADPC and Ready Asia Pacific, were privileged to present to the World Conference our seminal publication on resilient business for resilient nation and resilient communities. In that publication, we argued there are several things that we should and ought to do together. One is to provide the information to the SMEs. Informations become very expensive commodity. If an SME would like to know, am I standing on the fault line? That information is business intelligence that they have to cough up a lot of money to have access to. Am I on the line of the track of the cyclone for the next 15 years? That information is a privilege and you have to pay for it. Now the government is in a good position to access those information, break it down to the bite size, and present it to the SMEs in a language that are understandable to the SMEs, on the size that they can chew, the size that they can digest. That is one. Number two, of course, like our good Undersecretary from the Philippines is saying, we need a government policy regime that truly translates the privilege extended to the SMEs and give special treatment. Because we know SMEs cannot do the fancy dancing and singing like the big guys. It has to be size appropriate to SMEs. The third one that the government could do is actually, again, as was said, to provide the incentives. Some of this financial monetary incentive, but some more than financial as a non-financial. And of course, the capacity development is another thing. I'm very glad to know that colleague from Singapore has been come up with SME training. ADPC has been doing that, and we from UNESCAP look for partners to actually work on those things. Let me give you one good strategic place that we could actually put our pressure. You know, like a Chinese medicine, you have to put your fingers to where it really matters. Not just put it anywhere, it doesn't work. You have to look for the point where it works. And one of that is, it was mentioned earlier, chambers of commerce. The chambers is the place where the private sector talks using their logic and language. Like the good ambassador saying, this is their self-serving, profit-making avenue. And everything is good. And where government is also engaging, right? So the chamber of commerce is the one that, in our view, among several, are very strategic. Now, in UNESCAP, on the instruction of your governments, we put together UNESCAP Sustainable Business Network. And last year, out of the Sendai Imperative, that network establishes a task force on disaster risk reduction. And part of the strategy is to talk to build a conversation with, to provide references to Chamber of Commerce. So I'm looking at you, I'm looking at ADPC, I'm looking at Radio Asia Pacific, at GIZ. Work with us. Let's reach to those strategic points where it will reach the private sector and the government. That will help them to think together and give them some guidance on how to move forward with this. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm offering you the way forward from principle to practice. I cannot give you the detail now because the detail needs to be worked out, just like a marriage. Let's get married first and work out the detail later. If you want to work the detail now, we'll never get married. And our love will just disappear. So take a deep breath, let's work together, and let's address the chambers of commerce. Very simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pujiono, for your invitation to go even longer, higher, and be more ambitious than the just BCP stage. Your suggestion for training, government policy with special treatments for SMEs, the Chinese medicine approach, and then I won't detail too much regarding the marriage thing. It can become a big debate. Thank you for all these inspiring thoughts. We will have to pass to our next session. Will you be with us for the next hour? Yes. So please, I invite you, if you have an urgent question and you want to explore a little more what Mr. Pujiono shared with us, kindly do it after our next session. I would like to thank very warmly our 4 panelists and our amazing audience. And we are going to start now with our following panels with private sector. Thank you very much. Please, let's give them a hand.